thanks again for having me. As you said, I'm Santina Contreras. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Southern California in the Urban Planning and Spatial Analysis department in the Price School of Public Policy. I just actually got to USC this past year. And so prior to that, I was at Ohio State. And at Ohio State, I was lucky enough to have Monique as a graduate student that worked with me. And so today I'm going to be talking about some research that Monique and I did, I guess over the past couple of years. I say I was going to let her off the hook because she's not just a part of the project. She really is sort of like the life of this project. And so Monique brought this, and I don't want to speak for her. So, at the end, I hope that maybe you can chime in and sort of share what your experience was like. But a lot of this really came from questions that sort of she brought to the table that was so interested in and sort of led the work on this. And so we'll sort of provide some resources at the end in case people have more questions and sort of want to follow up. And so what I put together here is sort of pulling from great work that Monique did, some of the presentations that each of us had done separately. And so I'm hoping to try to go through that as quickly as possible. And then we can sort of save some time at the end just to ask questions, since I know you're all about to sort of do some really great work out in the field, and we want to be able to sort of talk through that as much as possible. So what we really wanted to just sort of share is sort of this project that we really took on, thinking about questions of manage retreat, relocation, resettlement in Puerto Rico. Before we get started in the actual data, I obviously wanted to go through a little bit of background, but I wanted to keep it quick because I know that this is, again, we're all sort of in friendly company of people that are already sort of working in this space. And so just to sort of contextualize what it is that we're talking about, there's a lot of, I think the best way to sort of start this is that, there's a lot of terms that sort of go hand in hand in talking about this space. And so, we'll talk about again, relocation, retreat, managed retreat, resettlement programs. I mean, all of these are, each have a different sort of space, right? And different sorts of definitions and lots that goes into each of these as sort of separate areas of work. And so, I didn't want to sort of take all of our time to sort of go through that, but there's, it's important to sort of make sure that we start by, laying the groundwork for the idea that there's a lot of sort of we have Anne Margaret here. This sort of a good example of sort of like this wealth of rich literature that's been going on in this space for quite some time. And so we're less focused in really sort of looking at the different sorts of lines across them and more just sort of pulling together this idea of sort of what we kind of loosely are just talking about, the idea of movement of people around some sort of hazard, disaster, climate related risk, right? And so, we're generally sort of thinking about when we talk about this, what does it mean when we're talking about the abandonment of some sort of coastline, or what you're going to see frequently referred to in this presentation as sort of risky in quotes, and we'll talk about why later, areas to areas that are safer. And so we often sort of present this, as, a really important resilience building tool that we sort of present because of the fact that it helps us sort of mitigate the risks that people may be experiencing in these places where they're living. Now, within that large literature of thinking about relocation, resettlement, all this sort of movement, right, we often also talk about a couple of different things, being that there are a lot of, wide level of positive benefits that can come from these sorts of activities, right? And so, we may not want to sort of jump to thinking about big, expensive construction and physical mitigative approaches, right? And so there's a lot of different talks of discussions around how this can sort of minimize these sorts of detrimental effects that may come from these other sorts of approaches. And so that's, one part that we often talk about. And just as similarly, right, we also talk about the potential issues that can arise from these sorts of activities, right? And so, you'll see a lot in the literature, sort of the problematic ways that these sorts of programs can be presented is sort of like they're the way that we need to go. It's sort of like the ultimate solution, and sort of rushing to do them, which can lead to a lot of potential problems, right? And so programs not being well designed, not being well aligned with sort of the beneficiaries of the ones that are actually going to have to go through this movement. And there's a lot of citations in the literature even talking about what this means in terms of it being one of like the more largely unpopular activities when it comes to sort of how it's received by the communities that are having to deal with it. And so that's one big part of the literature that we're sort of working through. The other is the idea of thinking about informal communities. And so again, to sort of set this in this sort of larger stage, informality is a big question, right? Lots of work on it. And it means lots, it can sort of have a, we can have a whole conversation just talking about defining the idea of what is informal and what isn't. And so again, we're not going to get into the details of that, but what we want to sort of, again, make sure that we're all sort of on the same page of what we're talking about is that, frequently when we're talking about informal communities, we're talking about some version of marginalization. Frequently, we may talk about things like non-traditional housing arrangements, and that can mean everything from self-constructed housing, but more frequently, it may not just be, or it may include this and or, right? There's lots of different variations, but often has some version of precarity in land security, right? And so whether it's actually self-constructed in sort of a problematic way or the way that it's sort of viewed in terms of what we're sort of used to seeing, all of this ends up sort of being the way that we can think of it. It's important to sort of be the tying point is it often needs some version of being excluded from formal planning processes, right? And so all of these different things can work their tentacles into planning in different ways. But whatever sort of version of informality we may be using as our bar, it most frequently does involve, meaning that because you don't sort of have that formal arrangement, the way that you're sort of connected to what decision making looks like from sort of a traditional standpoint in planning often looks very different. And the other thing that's really important for sort of, again, setting the stage for this project is that in addition to sort of this precarity and what that means for how you're connected to decision-making processes, it also is a space where there's often a lot of conversation around moving these communities, right? And so because there's lots of problems, because there's different sorts of connection points to what it looks like to your security, in terms of like your physical location, it is very common to sort of have discussions around relocation or resettlement of different sorts of motivations. Now, oftentimes relocation tends to be what we talk about more from sort of like a hazard and a climate perspective. Resettlement may be the language that you hear more frequently when you're talking about this from a planning perspective. And so that's part of a lot of what we looked at in terms of thinking about this from the literature and also in terms of how we framed our data collection. But it's important to sort of think about the ways that this is happening more broadly, even outside of Puerto Rico. And so to spend more of the time, I wanted to sort of talk through the case study of what we looked at. And so again, we're looking at informal communities in Puerto Rico. And so, I wanted to start here because this is something that Monique and I had a lot of conversations about, just in terms of thinking about how you even start this conversation. How do you define this? What does it look like? Because it can have lots of different names. And now this again isn't something that is just unique to Puerto Rico. This is something that we grapple with when we're thinking about informal communities across the world, right? There's a lot of questions around different sorts of informal communities may go for different sorts of naming conventions in different locations. And that also can mean different things depending on who you're talking to, right? And so we, have lots of evidence in lots of different locations, but some what we're going to talk about today in Puerto Rico is, what that means for the communities who are living in these places, right? And so something like defining them as a special communities, or sort of what we learned is sort of maybe sort of the overarching way that they sort of describe from sort of like a planning policy perspective, that falls different ways for the members that are actually living there, right? So you get a lot of people that this is not sort of like their ideal way to be categorized, or sort of a really negative connotation with that. And that, it sort of varies. And so it's important to sort of keep that in mind when we're talking about any informal community, let alone the ones that we're going to be talking about today. And then the other part is sort of thinking about this larger history of what planning movement looks like for these communities, right? And so there's a lot of literature just talking about the different sorts of ways and the different sorts of examples of how some version of relocation or resettlement has been taking place for a long time in Puerto Rico, right? And so whether that's for reasons in terms of just moving informal communities from like a resettlement standpoint, right, in terms of improving housing and that sort of side of it, or for some, again, what tends to be a lot of the focus of what we see in our data here is sort of more environmental hazard focus, right? And so, there's a lot of examples of these projects that sort of have been really defining, like historically, in terms of thinking about communities, specifically informal communities, having to be relocated because of large scale floods or other sorts of environmental hazard events. And so that's sort of to sort of keep in mind what this looks like in terms of like the larger history. And so for the data collection, right? And so again, what we looked at, and when I say, we, that's why I say, Monique is the most productive, researcher. She was able to sort of lead a lot of this research in sort of what were very trying times, because this all happened in sort of pandemic time period. But we were fortunate enough to get a Mitigation Matters grant from the Natural Hazards Center. And so that funded us doing a 2-phase project where we looked at perspectives on relocation of informal communities from 2 different sides. The first phase looks specifically at talking to planners, sort of more people on the technical side. So we talked to local planners, public officials, people that sort of worked in the hazard profession space, and conducted interviews with them. And then in the second phase, we did small focus groups with informal community residents and leaders, right? And so all of this happened online. And so that's why I say, I don't know. So this is, it still sort of is amazing to me to be able to even conduct that we all do our data collection online, because that was not what we were expecting when we originally got the grant, right? All of this, we had a very different version of what the project was going to look like in person. And so we're happy also to talk about that at the end as well, because Monique can probably share, the ups and downs of what that looked like, having to sort of rejigger something like this. Because again, I wanted to spend some time to just sort of say that, because it is something that is sort of really important to think about when you're thinking about a space like informal communities, right? Because these are cases where it really does often require sort of like the best version of data collection to really be able to sort of embed yourself in the community in that way. And that was sort of what the original intention of this project was. But unfortunately, we weren't able to do that because of COVID restrictions. And so we were lucky enough to be able to sort of conduct some of this still online through sort of some small focus groups. And I put also on here, again, to sort of reflect some of the variations that happened in terms of the different sorts of phases we had to take with the project. The original sort of idea was to sort of focus on 2 communities. And so looking at Vietnam and Via del Sol, which are sort of some good historical markers in terms of sort of these bigger relocation events that have sort of happened in Puerto Rico. But again, because of the change in the data collection, we sort of opened that up to be willing to sort of look at informal community perspectives more broadly across the island. And so that's sort of why you see that variation there. And then this was all qualitatively analyzed, and we're going to share the results for that today. And so the couple of themes that I wanted to try to go through as quickly as possible, I put here, more or less what I really wanted to talk to is just sort of some of the justification and decision-making that we found from our data that was sort of explaining what was going on behind a lot of the relocation activities, what that looks like in terms of how people are moved, and then sort of linking that a little bit more broadly to some of the community-based, community-led part, because that's a little bit more the area of research that I do more frequently, is sort of looking at community engagement and what that looks like in terms of those dynamics in these spaces. So to start, the first thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about was sort of what we saw in terms of this idea of sort of like justification and thinking about the reasons to relocate. Now, I wanted to start with sort of thinking about, again, we sort of did this in this phased way. And so, starting out, you look at this from sort of like the planner perspective, and I wanted to put this here because this kind of shows this sort of like a lot of what our general understanding of thinking about relocation often looks like, right? And so when you talk to planners, oftentimes what they'll tell you is that the reason why we need to initiate some version of relocation is really to mitigate risks, right? That's sort of like the most simple way of putting it, right? It always sort of, sort of centers back to addressing a risk in some way. It often may include conversations around different sorts of versions of that type of risk, right? So how severe is it? How intense it is? Is it happening now? Is it going to happen in the future? All of those things are a lot of the language that you hear sort of described from planners in terms of this risk mitigation being the reason to be able to move forward. And then also, again, from the informality side, right? Thinking about addressing the sort of some of the root things that you think about when you think about informality. Inadequate infrastructure, what that looks like in terms of quality of construction and housing, and then sort of addressing some of these land tenure questions. And so that's sort of, I think that sort of like starting point is sort of that sort of, it sort of always connects back to sort of what it means in terms of this risk mitigation question. When you go a little bit deeper, one of the things that comes up quite a bit, which I think is important to sort of talk about, is that, again, while we often sort of present relocation as sort of like a really important sort of piece of the mitigation puzzle, it's important to reflect on what we know about hazard planning more broadly. And so, we often talk about the different sorts of phases that are involved in sort of thinking about a hazard event. And so, mitigation is a really important part of it. But it's important, I think, to recognize that oftentimes what comes from the planners quite a bit is that even though it is an important approach, it's often sort of the last resort, or sort of the last option is what you hear planners talk about pretty frequently, right? And so when you're not able to do other things, then fine, we're going to try to do relocation. And so I think it's important to think about also too, a lot of this, I think it sort of ties into a lot of, I said in the beginning, there can be sort of negative connotations and sort of the sentiment that goes along with relocation. And so it is important to sort of reflect on that part as the connection point, but that's something that we found quite frequently. And then within that, though, I think that's sort of like a lot of times what, I think for a lot of us, that's sort of like what it sort of makes sense when you think about relocation is sort of, okay, yes, it has to do with risk. And so what we were really interested in, though, is sort of like unpacking that a little bit more to understand, like, what does it mean when you say from risk to safety, right? Like, what does risk mean? What does safety mean? Like, sort of what are the framings that are going on in those words, right? Because we kind of say them, but it's kind of loaded if you really think about it. And so when you sort of go, deeper into sort of like what people are saying, what you start to see when you look at this from sort of a planning perspective is that, risk really is very, very, very tied to the idea of risk to, it's not just risk general, it's risk to environmental hazards, right? And so the prioritization of environmental hazard risks is of sort of like utmost importance, highest level, right? And so pretty much the majority of the conversations tend to be very, very laser focused on thinking about being safe, and safe meaning safe from hazard risks. That's sort of the first part. The part on top of that is that in addition to it frequently being about some version of an environmental hazard, it often is also very, very focused on a specific type of environmental hazard, right? So if we're talking about flooding, for example, which is what the quote here shows, there's a community, they're at risk to flooding, and so we have to mitigate that flooding risk, so we move them away from the flooding risk. And so again, some of this seems sort of obvious, right? Like, we're talking about flooding, we don't want many people, like, those are all things that maybe sort of are loosely in our minds already when we think about these, but what we're trying to really sort of get very specific about is the idea that oftentimes we're just saying move them from risk, and risk in these cases is sort of being almost in some ways, if you think about it, narrowly defined based on, again, first the environmental piece, and then also then just the one risk that's sort of being, faced in front of them, because of that sort of like the thing that seems the most relevant, because potentially there was an issue with it, or it's sort of been identified as a key issue from the environmental perspective. The thing that you start paying attention to, right, is that means oftentimes that risks due to other sorts of hazards may not be being considered, right? And so again, it's not, again, all this is not to sort of, put things in sort of like a negative or a positive way. This, again, is obviously as part of the data collection and analysis standpoint, is all just about sort of like working through some of these ideas. But what we see pretty frequently is that there is an issue in terms of what we're thinking about what's included in that sort of risk categorization. And so thinking about, say, for in that last quote where it was flooding, and so we need to move people away from flooding. Now, that may not mean that you're looking at the other sorts of risks that a potential community is exposed to. A really good example of this is something that came up pretty frequently, is sort of what that means in terms of thinking about how those risks may change, right? And so something like climate change, right? Like, that may put people at exposure in different ways. That may not be part of this conversation because you're very focused on that one sort of risk that you were originally trying to move from. The other reason why thinking about it in that way, you can sort of see some, potential issues in that sort of limited framing, is when we look at this compared to sort of the data that we collected on the community side. And so when you look at it from the community side, you see sort of like a much bigger picture of what sort of communities are talking about when you ask them about what makes something risky, what makes something safe, right? And so you have a lot of conversations around things like, what does the quality of their housing look like? How are they accessing infrastructure? The public health issues that they may be being faced with, right? there's lots of conversations around what this looks like in terms of sort of, do I feel like physically safe because of, security concerns or violence, these sorts of things. And so hazard risks does come in there, right? Like you'll see it in the data, but it's not maybe as, and that's why I sort of put hazard risk question mark, right? Because it sometimes, doesn't come up, or maybe it comes up, but not always in the same way that you see it in the same level of importance when you see it from the planning perspective. And so I think that, sort of even this short quote at the end, right, where sort of it's like community saying like, yeah, the thing I really care about, like that's great, but not having infrastructure, not having clean water, not feeling safe in my community, like that, those are the things that may be really prominent for community members. And so I think it's important to sort of like reflect on that, it's not to say that, like, again, planners have a job, particularly like I said, some of the people that we talked to were hazard professionals, right? And so it makes sense, if you really think about it from a perspective of like, yes, of course, someone that is sort of well-trained to think about a hazard is going to sort of identify that. I speak as someone that was a former engineer that was like obsessed with the one, hazard issue that was like, that was the most important thing. But we really sort of want to think through what this means in terms of the bigger picture, right? Because obviously people are dealing with lots of different issues. This is sort of like a intersecting, compounding sort of risk question, right? That there's a lot of communities that are dealing with more than one thing. And so you sort of start to see these sort of differences in how that's framed. And so, what we kind of highlight here is that this is sort of starts to highlight some of these disconnections and sort of these different ways that risk and safety ideas are framed. And so, while it can be very important for us as planners, and particularly hazard planners, to be thinking about these sort of hazard-centered risk questions, when connecting that back to sort of what we're seeing from the community members, we see that communities might not necessarily feel safer, which is ultimately kind of the goal often that we're trying to accomplish from a relocation or a resettlement program, if all these other things aren't addressed, right? So, a lot of good it does us to get them out of this, but then they're still sort of feeling risky in different other sorts of ways. And so that's sort of what we want to highlight there, that it's really important to sort of work through what these disconnections can look like, both in sort of the approach that we take in terms of what we're managing, but also just in terms of like the communication. So even if it does end up being that it really is important that we have to address this over the other things, what does that look like in terms of how we're sort of working with communities to understand the reason why that risk may be particularly important? The kind of accompanying piece to this is this idea of what risks look like in the new location. And so new location meaning the place that people get moved to. And so the part with here that we want to make sure to sort of bring up is that, part of what sort of happens oftentimes is it's sort of, lost in communication a bit, the idea that, I think what people that work in this space are pretty comfortable is that there's risk everywhere, right? There's kind of no such thing as a risk-free place. We like to believe there is, or we hope there is, or maybe that's something we could take issue with and have a conversation about, right? But usually there's not. It's not as shocking to find out, right, that people get moved and that there happens to be something of risk in the other location. But these sorts of things aren't things that we are sort of dominate our conversations around relocation and resettlement, right? It's almost in some ways presented as sort of, this is dangerous, this is safe, right? And so we sort of use these big lumping words because that's kind of in sort of like a rough way of sometimes what these conversations look like. And so, what starts happening is that you start to see, when you start unpacking the idea of what happens when you move people to a new place. And the reality is that there are continual risks in those new locations. And you can see this in different sorts of ways, right? And so a new location may have, and this is the different sorts of versions of what we worked through and had a lot of conversations, Monique and I, right? Is that, so you can move a community potentially, and then in the new place, they're less exposed to the original risk that they faced in the original location, right? So again, to keep on that flooding example, they were exposed to flooding in the old place, you move them someplace new, and now there's not as much of a flooding risk, but potentially now they're exposed to something different, right? And so now they're more exposed to earthquakes, for example. No more flooding, but now they have this new issue. There can be a situation where communities are less exposed to the original risk at the time of the movement, but then because of changing circumstances, and so this is a very climate change, climate impact sort of a thing, they weren't more exposed at the time of movement, but because climate impacts weren't considered over time, they do become more impacted, right? And so that's another situation that we have to talk about. And then the third, which is the one I think that we are oftentimes the least comfortable talking about, but it is a thing, is that you can move communities and they still have exposure to even the same risk, right? Maybe not at the exact same level, right? But it doesn't, there's also this sort of piece of it that involves, particularly when we're talking about informal communities, because we're talking about lots of different reasons that may have motivated the movement to begin with, right? So if we're talking about more of the development concerns, less so than the hazard related, right? Communities can just be moved because, again, of the reasonings that happen for resettlement from a development standpoint, and still have it risk exposure more broadly, right? And so these are different sorts of things that are part of the conversation. I put here some of the additional work that Monique did, which was sort of looking at different sorts of hazard mapping data for the two case studies that I mentioned that we originally talked about, Villa del Sol and Vietnam, to sort of look at what was happening in terms of where the communities were, where they got moved to, and the different sorts of risk exposure in the pre and post locations, right? And so, what you see is that, there can be different sorts of variations in terms of what those risks look like in the new place. And so I think what is most important for this conversation, and again, we can get into some of the more details later, but it's less about, again, trying to like demonize planners bad for moving people here or trying to find this. That I think is a more complex conversation, which is important to have. But more, what I think I wanted just to make the point here is that again, there are these key things that connect back to sort of how we engage, how we communicate with communities, that is at least a starting point in terms of having these conversations. And so what I put here is particularly what this means in terms of like community distrust in the process. So one of the things that came up quite a bit in the community data is sort of community members, feeling like they do not trust the relocation process. That's something that comes up a lot in the relocation literature, right? Is community members feeling a certain way about what's going to happen? Do I trust the planners? Do I trust the policymakers, right? So that's a big problem that we already know is sort of in existence when we're talking about these sort of movement programs. And so the reason why I kind of put these images here and sort of make this point about the idea that risk continues is because what we sort of hear from people, right, is that they moved me and there's still risk. Like I'm still getting flood risk, or it was okay for a little bit and now it's still here. And so, what to some extent from a planning perspective may seem, not as problematic because risk was reduced to a certain extent, or, we can sort of look at it in this sort of larger picture to what that means in terms of sort of whether or not that decision making around the movement made sense. A lot of that is not communicated or part of the process of engagement that happens with community members. And so in result is not really helping the whole idea of sort of how do we build trust, because when we're telling community members that the reason why we're moving you is because you're at risk and over here you won't be at risk, when they continue to see risk, it doesn't exactly make it seem like that was a well understood and communicated portion of the process. And so that's part of, I think, the larger point that at least we wanted to sort of at least let sit with ourselves for a little bit in terms of thinking about what we need to do in terms of thinking about the risk more broadly, and if that changes what we need to be doing in terms of thinking about where we move people and how we move them. That's one part. But then even when we make the decision that it makes the most sense to do it, how we actually tie that into what we do in terms of linking that with community discussions around this can probably go a long way in terms of building trust in the process more broadly. So it doesn't seem like we're telling them we're moving them to a place that is not risky. And then they see this sort of unfolding in different ways over time. So that's kind of, I think, something that we wanted to talk about with that. The other thing sort of connected to this building trust part is sort of the idea of sort of what happens from our past actions, right? And so another thing that comes up quite a bit was the ways that community members are obviously very aware of what's going on around them, right? And so what happens very frequently is that because they have seen very loose goals, loose motivations happening around relocation activities around them, maybe even they've maybe experienced something similar themselves, they again have distrust in the process. And so this is really, really true, particularly comes up obviously a lot as a big point of contention when thinking about places like Puerto Rico in terms of thinking about development-induced displacement, right? And so particularly when we're talking about moving communities, telling them that we have to move them because it's super unsafe, and then a hotel, sort of like magically appears in that area that was too not safe for, it wasn't safe enough for them to live in, and they sort of see these different sorts of things happening around them, creates these sort of sentiments of, no, thank you, I don't want to be a part of this process at all. And so again, recognizing both what we're doing currently, but also the impacts that are sort of happening from the past projects are important in terms of sort of introducing these sorts of ideas when they're happening. And so the last thing that I wanted to sort of talk about just really quickly is, and this isn't as much in the report, this is something that we've been working on in terms of sort of accompanying, building on a lot of this sort of initial data, that the preliminary findings that you all might have already read in that briefer report, is sort of some of the things that sort of can also happen in follow-up to this, which is that, because these disconnections are happening between, I sort of gave these a few examples of what's happening between, planners have one idea of what relocation looks like, communities have another, and then again, there's these gaps in between. They may not be speaking the same language, they may not have the same priorities. When we're talking about something like informal communities, often what happens is, because there's these gaps, and because things are not being addressed, they have to get filled in some way. And so often what happens is you see community members sort of having to sort of pull together to sort of address the things that they actually thought were the biggest concerns, that were the biggest safety concerns to them. And you sort of see a lot of these community-led initiatives sort of coming to place in a way to sort of fill the gaps that are happening from these disconnections between the two spaces. And so just to give a couple examples of this, right? And so, this is almost kind of the what can happen after relocation, because we kind of leave the story there, right? We relocate them, and as if it sort of magically all appears. When we're talking about informal communities, again, this isn't always the end of the story. And so what often happens is that the communities get moved to a new location. And again, because the priority was thinking about this from a risk perspective, maybe that was involved not fully making sure that this new community is fully developed, right? And so oftentimes you still see informal communities initiating some new version of development, right? So they're having to put in, their own housing, they're doing some sort of makeshift, basic services and infrastructure, because the movement happened to get them out of the risky location, but all of the other things didn't necessarily get filled, right? And so then you see these sorts of activities happening. You see them sort of coming together to, build organizations and sort of try to continue to sort of address all these things that they didn't see, getting fixed in the relocation process. And there's also a lot of evidence of different sorts of ways that they also attack this from a hazard planning perspective, right? So, modifying what they do in terms of their building behaviors, which is sort of what we know to be very mitigative, developing their own emergency response teams and aid distribution, right? To, again, address things that in a perfect world, we would hope that when a community gets relocated, everything is sort of working perfectly, but oftentimes we don't see that happening. And so a lot of that is really coming from the community. And so, I just always want to make sure put this as well, just as sort of the ending piece, which is that, it's really in a lot of ways kind of empowering, I guess, to see communities sort of filling these gaps, but it's always really important to acknowledge what this means in terms of the problematicness, again, of sort of these resilience building narratives, which is the communities, again, having to sort of fill these gaps is really, if we really look deeply at it, is sort of reflective of informal communities, again, sort of having to sort of carry undue burdens, which is that these are sort of responsibilities that planners, policymakers should be doing in that relocation process, right? If they don't just need to be moved from a hazard, they need housing, they need all these different things. And so in a lot of ways, them having to sort of carry that work and sort of fill those gaps, really speaks to a lot of the literature that we know more broadly in terms of, what that looks like around, absolving sort of the state from their responsibility and sort of putting that responsibility on community members, which is really not what we want to be doing. And so it's important to sort of think about, be cognizant of the ways that our inability to really look at the full picture of potentially what communities may be needing in this process sort of shifts this burden onto them and creates additional work for them. And so, yeah, just to wrap up, I just wanted to again sort of end, just to try to end it a little bit on some of like the more, I think what I think we find to be a little bit more of the more positive takeaways. I was recently realized that some of my classes when I was teaching, like everything can always be a little bit of a downer when you're working in disasters and hazards and all of that. So the more, what I think is the much more uplifting, powerful part is to think about sort of the things that we heard from community members that I think gives me more hope, right? Which is that there's a lot of ways that we can improve the process, right? Because I think one of the things that sat with me a lot was that, we often talk about relocation as being like, again, it's very understood that communities are often really resistant to it. They don't want to be doing this. And that, we've read a lot of articles and we cite some of them in our work talking about that it's, one of the most unpopular things. But it's often when we talk to the community members, they just really are more open to sharing that it's not that they don't want to do it, they just are never really invited to having a conversation. And again, this is really important when we're thinking about informal communities, because that's what I started with saying, that disconnection from the formal decision-making process because of their precarity often is why, we sort of see this happening time and time again. And so what we hear from them, right, is that, if you come to us, if you have a conversation, like a real conversation where you want to be open and have a dialogue about the things that we need in this process, we're more than happy to have it. And we actually, what we hear more frequently is that they don't want to be living in unsafe, risky situations, but they want to be part of the process that's going to actually work towards improving that. And they also share a lot about what they sort of consider as like the ideal relocation process. And so Monique asked a lot of, everyone that she interviewed, what does this look like if this was sort of like the perfect way, right? Like, and so we, I think learned a lot about, the different ways that this could happen. And it doesn't have to be, as, disconnected as we often find it to be. But it does require sort of thinking much more broadly about who we're bringing into the conversation, sort of how we're sort of structuring what the programs look like. And so I think in a lot of ways, the key takeaway here becomes thinking about this in terms of a combination of two things. One being, what are the needs that are required and when we're talking about relocation? And I, really specifically put not just hazardous, right? Because again, that always is where planners start. And again, based on our data, that it always tends to be centralized there, but thinking much more broadly about all the different things that are at play when we're thinking about needs for community members around the relocation process. And then again, that inclusivity in terms of bringing them into this whole conversation becomes sort of like the two, I think, messaging points that we sort of heard very loudly when we went through all of this data. And so the last thing I just wanted to put here is, again, so I think some of you may have gotten a chance to read the report, but we do have a technical report and a research brief that accompany the grant that we got from Natural Hazard Center. And so you can find that on their website. I also wanted to give a shout out to Monique's thesis. So she did her master's thesis, which kind of unpacks all this in much more depth. We can either, I'm not sure if that's publicly available, she can chime in at the end, but if that's not, we're happy to sort of give you more info on that. And then we're also working on some manuscripts specifically on that sort of community-led piece and sort of like what that looks like in terms of filling gaps in the relocation process. And so that's in progress, and we're happy to share that whenever that gets finalized and published. And we just wanted to thank you for your time and open it up for questions. And